Professor Algernon Croft's workshop was less a place of science and more a mausoleum of near successes, an echo chamber for grandiose, unfulfilled promises. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of weak afternoon sun that pierced the grimy windowpanes, illuminating a chaotic scene of half-finished dreams. Gears, gleaming and broken, lay scattered like fallen shields. Blueprints, yellowed and annotated with frantic, hopeful scribbles, papered the walls. The air, thick with the scent of lubricating oil and stale ambition, clung to everything. At the heart of this mechanical chaos stood the flyer of the age, the ornithopter. It was a magnificent, tragic sight. Vast, articulated wings of stretched canvas and finely worked wood that promised the impossible, yet were fundamentally unsound. Croft, a man whose 40 years sat uneasily upon him, viewed the machine not with an engineer's critical eye but with an artist's blind adoration. He was a fusion of genius and utter recklessness, his feverish gaze fixed on the heavens while his feet remained firmly mired in debt. Every shilling he possessed, every inheritance left by his long-suffering uncle, had been poured into the ornithopter. The family estate was mortgaged to the hilt. Failure, to Croft, was not a scientific possibility, but merely a temporary setback for others. He was entirely blind to the mounting financial ruin and the desperate state of his own health, which was strained by sleepless nights and hurried, inadequate meals. He tightened a bolt on the main drive, his hands trembling slightly, yet his voice, when he spoke to his lone, unseen assistant, was firm. "It is a machine of pure logic, Mr. Finch. A tribute to Deadless, but perfected." The deadline loomed like a scaffold. Tomorrow, the public unveiling. Croft had sent out invitations under the guise of an air transport corporation, a company that existed only in his head. Tomorrow, New London would witness history, or more likely, a very public catastrophe. Croft, however, saw only the headlines. Croft soars to glory. The subtle weaknesses in the frame, the alarming tendency of the wings to flutter unevenly, were dismissed as minor atmospheric resistances. He ignored the real, physical limits, consumed by the glorious delusion of flight. The date was set, the descent was inevitable. The chosen venue for Professor Croft's grand endeavor was not a field, but a narrow, imposing avenue in the borough of Whitechapel, one of the few long stretches of road relatively free from heavy cart traffic. The cobblestones, slick with the morning's mist and the city's perpetual grime, served as a stark, unforgiving runway. By mid-morning, the avenue had transformed into a cramped amphitheater, lined with expectant, skeptical faces, all drawn by the promise of free entertainment, be it triumph or tragedy. Amidst the pressing crowd stood Elara and her son, Bartholomew. Elara, a woman hardened by the necessity of survival, clutched Bartholomew's hand with a grip that was less affectionate and more restrictive. She had once been a seamstress of respectable quality, but now found herself mending torn fishing nets and the tattered canvas of reckless inventors to keep a meager roof over their heads. The professor's canvas wings, in fact, had been her latest project. She harbored no romantic illusions about the flyer of the age. She had felt the inferior quality of the thread, seen the shortcuts Croft had taken with the fabric, a desperate prayer stitched together by a madman. Her presence was purely pragmatic. She needed to ensure she received her final, overdue payment before the inevitable disaster rendered Croft insolvent. She was a woman of grim pragmatism, seeing the ornithopter not as a marvel of engineering, but as yet another unstable venture built on the backs of the poor. Bartholomew, however, was in a world utterly removed from his mother's anxieties. At 7 years old, the towering machine, with its immense, articulated wings, was the most fantastical object he had ever beheld. His eyes, wide and luminous with innocence, followed the light reflecting off the brass fittings. He whispered to his mother, "Will it truly fly, Mama? Will he touch the clouds?" His boyish wonder, the unadulterated belief in the possibility of the impossible, formed a sharp, painful contrast to Elara's cynical certainty. She squeezed his hand tighter, tasting the metallic tang of fear. The child's soaring imagination was a reflection of Croft's, and she knew, with a sinking heart, that both were about to be brutally dashed against the hard reality of the Cobblestone arena. Housed within a privately cordoned-off section near the avenue's entrance stood the elite spectators, Mr. and Mrs. Beaumont. Their presence was a calculated ornament of New London's established, cynical wealth. Mr. Barnaby Beaumont, a man whose corpulence was matched only by his influence, stood with his arms crossed over a waistcoat of blinding white linen. He was the proprietor of the vast Beaumont Chemical Works, a sprawling industrial monster near the docks that provided much of the city's necessary, yet foul-smelling, commerce. He viewed Professor Croft as a necessary fool, a distraction. If the public was preoccupied with flying clowns, they paid less attention to the noxious effluvium billowing from the dockside. "A waste of perfectly good canvas," Mr. Beaumont murmured to his wife, his voice a low, rumbling dismissiveness. "The man is a charlatan seeking capital." Mrs. Evadne Beaumont, however, had a more refined, if equally cold, perspective. She saw the event as a mandatory social exhibition. Clad in an unnecessarily elaborate silk day dress, she clutched a pair of mother-of-pearl opera glasses, ready to critique the spectacle, and the inevitable failure, with surgical precision. Her interest was piqued not by the machine, but by the potential for social schadenfreude. She had positioned herself for the best view of Croft's humiliation. They represented the true power of the city, capable of making or breaking a man like Croft with a single bored shrug. Their conversation, a veneer of polite commentary, drifted to the minor illnesses that had recently flared up among the dockside laborers. "Another outbreak of the fever, Barnaby?" Mrs. Beaumont inquired, adjusting her silk gloves. "It's dreadfully inconvenient for the servants." Mr. Beaumont merely waved a dismissive hand. "Nonsense. The usual ailments of the lower classes. Bad water, bad habits. Nothing for us to concern ourselves with. Besides," he added, his gaze returning to the ornithopter, "this little sideshow should keep the newspapers quite busy for the next few days. One failure masks another." The air around the couple was heavy with their shared, icy disdain, a stark contrast to the innocent hope burning in young Bartholomew's eyes nearby. Professor Croft, having ascended the fragile wooden steps to the cockpit, stood triumphant atop the ornithopter. The morning mist had burned off, but the air felt unnaturally heavy, almost viscous. A strange, low-lying atmospheric phenomenon had begun to assert itself in the distance, a subtle change that went unnoticed by the excited majority. It was the first sighting of the dark Smudge Croft would later be accused of ignoring. Low to the southeast, a dense, pale green-yellow cloud was creeping along the rooflines of the dockside factories. A subtle metallic scent, unlike the usual coal smoke or river stench, drifted faintly over the crowd. Most dismissed it as the city's perpetual grime, an occupational hazard of New London life. Croft, adjusting the ridiculously oversized leather goggles over his eyes, was too consumed by his own impending glory to notice any atmospheric peculiarity. He began his final flowery speech, his voice booming with forced confidence. He spoke of defying the tyranny of the horizontal, of shattering the chains of gravity. "Observe, ladies and gentlemen," he bellowed, gesturing dramatically towards the vast, open sky above. "The wind is with us. A perfect, favorable current to lift us into the firmament." In reality, the wind was erratic, eddying around the taller buildings in unpredictable gusts. A young, nervous apprentice, a lad named Thomas, rushed forward, desperate to catch Croft's attention. "Professor! The bolt on the main starboard pivot, it's loose. The last calibration failed, sir." Croft merely fixed the boy with a contemptuous, almost pitying wave of his hand. "Silence, you nervous amateur. A few degrees of play are necessary for atmospheric flexibility. Your lack of vision will not impede my genius." The professor's refusal to heed the warning, from the ground, and from the sky, was his final, fatal act of hubris. He strapped himself in, his face shining with sweat and desperate anticipation, completely blind to the fact that his chosen moment of triumph was rapidly aligning with a genuine, tangible threat approaching from the city's periphery. The dark smudge grew wider, silently devouring the light. Professor Croft's final address to the public was less an explanation of mechanics and more a sermon of boundless, technological faith. He held the crowd rapt, his voice now hoarse but ringing with messianic zeal. He painted a vibrant, impossible picture of the future, a world connected by aerial pathways, where the grit of New London was left below, and only the pure, rarefied air was inhaled. "Imagine," he cried, his arms spread wide, mirroring the span of the canvas wings. "To breakfast in London, and dine in Paris. The tyranny of distance, broken. The shackles of the earth, shattered." He detailed, with flowery, over-the-top language, the mechanisms, the harmonic convergence of the levers, the atmospheric communion of the canvas, but offered no concrete, mathematical proof of his success. It was pure poetry, captivating the crowd and blinding them to the reality of the machine's evident flaws. The large-format camera, a formidable wooden box on a tripod, was positioned strategically by a young operator. He had spent 10 minutes carefully preparing the heavy glass plate, waiting for the pivotal, historical moment. He was instructed to capture the peak of the ascent, the singular frame where man and machine achieved the impossible. The crowd leaned in, their tension mounting. It was an atmosphere of morbid anticipation rather than genuine hope. They were not witnessing the birth of flight, they were awaiting the moment of spectacular collapse. The focus shifted briefly to the machine itself, where the flaws were cruelly exposed under the harsh daylight. A stressed joint on the central axle was visibly vibrating. A fraying tension wire, dangerously close to snapping, whistled softly in the uncertain breeze. Elara, having worked with the materials, saw these weaknesses with a rising sense of nausea. She knew the exact points of failure, the corners Croft had cut, the inferior grade of canvas she had warned him about. The machine felt less like a vehicle, and more like a bomb with a wick lit. Her panic was a cold, sharp thing, born from the certainty that the glorious promise of lift was, in fact, an impending and violent surrender to gravity. The moment of truth arrived not with a roar, but with a series of frantic, desperate movements. Professor Croft, having finished his peroration, took a deep, shuddering breath and committed himself to the pedals. The initial push-off was heavy and awkward. The wheels, too small for the contraption's considerable weight, ground against the uneven cobblestones, their friction sounding like the gritting of teeth. Croft began to pedal furiously, his face immediately contorted with effort, the goggles sliding slightly down his nose. The sheer physics of generating the necessary lift became a visible, straining ordeal. The giant wings, meant to emulate the grace of a bat, began to pump. But the motion was not fluid, it was a jerky, unnatural rhythm. The sound that accompanied the effort was the most telling failure. Not the majestic whoosh of flight, but the tortured, high-pitched screech of stressed metal and groaning wood. It was the silent protest of the machine's components, each joint and bolt crying out against the unreasonable demands being placed upon it. The ornithopter struggled for elevation, defying gravity not through mastery, but through brute force. It lumbered forward for agonizing yards before, impossibly, it achieved a scant few feet of vertical clearance. For one singular, terrifying moment, the machine hung suspended in the air. The crowd gasped, a collective sound of impossible belief washing over the street. The boy, Bartholomew, let out a tiny, hopeful cheer. Croft, too, believed he had done it. His expression was a fleeting mask of transcendent triumph. But the moment was illusory, bought only by momentum and desperation. The weight was too great, the mechanics too flawed, and the physics of the design too stubbornly resistant to his will. Gravity, the silent, omnipresent warden, waited patiently to reassert its absolute dominion. The moment of impossible suspension lasted barely a heartbeat. The brief, desperate victory of momentum over mass was brutally extinguished. The end came not as a slow descent, but as a loud, sickening crack that cleaved the air and sliced through the crowd's collective gasp. It was the sound of the main wooden spar, stressed beyond its limits, fracturing completely. Instantly, the left wing buckled, folding in on itself like a broken fan. The machine, unbalanced and structurally compromised, began to spiral violently. The right wing followed almost immediately. The ornithopter did not merely fall, it catastrophically imploded. The canvas, Elara's careful stitching tearing with a dreadful finality, ripped away in great swathes. The scattered gears, driven by the machine's final, desperate rotation, scattered like shrapnel across the cobblestones. The wood groaned in one long, tortured sigh before the entire contraption collapsed in on itself, a heap of broken engineering and shredded ambition. A cloud of dust and splintered debris billowed into the air, obscuring the awful tableau for a suffocating moment. When the dust settled, a horrifying silence reigned, broken only by the distant, unnoticed sound of the approaching Smudge. Professor Croft was buried beneath the wreckage. He was extracted minutes later, alive, but badly injured, a mangled figure in tweed and leather, his face bloodied and his eyes wide with a profound, terrifying shock. His glorious dream had been violently shattered into 1,000 useless pieces of debris. The camera operator, paralyzed until the dust began to clear, finally squeezed the bulb. The photograph was taken in the dust-filled, silent aftermath, capturing the definitive scene, the wreckage, the stunned faces of the onlookers, and the irrefutable truth of a spectacular public failure. The date, 1893, would forever be linked to the image of his splintered ruin. The immediate aftermath was a flurry of chaotic, short-lived activity. Police constables, relieved to deal with a familiar problem of wreckage rather than an unknown aerial marvel, swarmed the area. They began the process of clearing the avenue, dismissing the incident as a tragic, yet isolated, engineering folly, a typical New London eccentricity gone wrong. The crowd, their appetite for morbid spectacle satisfied, began to melt away. Gossip was already being traded, theories of incompetence and insanity were exchanged with relish. Mr. Beaumont, ever the opportunist, pushed past the officers. He approached the crumpled heap of wood and metal, already negotiating its purchase for scrap value. His voice, low and transactional, sliced through the quietude of the disaster site. "I'll take the lot off your hands, officer. Prevent further public disruption." Within 20 minutes, the scene of the grand failure was nearly deserted, reduced to a collection of scattered debris and a few lingering constables. But one small figure remained. Young Bartholomew, pulled back by the shell-shocked Elara, was fixated on the ground near the main impact point. He had not cried or shrieked. Instead, his fear had solidified into an unnerving stillness. He moved away from his mother's grasp and pointed a small, tentative finger. Lying amongst the splintered wood and torn canvas was a small, heavy piece of metal. It was not a wing support or a rudder hinge. It was a valve, dark and strangely pristine compared to the wreckage. Elara, whose fear had now been replaced by a gnawing emptiness, followed his gaze. She saw the valve and felt a familiar cold dread. The disaster was inevitable, yes, but its ending felt wrong, incomplete. The wreckage was too clean, the destruction too focused. Bartholomew's innocent observation, pointing out the strange foreign object, hinted at a deeper, more profound truth. The failure of the ornithopter was perhaps only the most visible symptom of a disaster yet to be fully revealed. The dark smudge on the horizon was no longer a distant curiosity. It had advanced with alarming, unseen speed. Within the time it took the constables to secure the ornithopter wreckage, the atmospheric phenomenon had grown from a faint haze to a towering, malevolent presence. It was not a storm, nor common fog, but a billowing, pale green-yellow chemical cloud. It moved with an unnatural inertia, hugging the ground and seeping upwards from the dockside industrial district. The epicenter was frighteningly clear, the area surrounding the sprawling Beaumont chemical works. Mr. Barnaby Beaumont's minor illnesses amongst the workers were now revealed as a full-scale toxic crisis, unleashed by a catastrophic, uncontained leak. A terrified silence fell over the few remaining officials as the metallic, pungent odor, once faint, now acrid and suffocating, hit the city center. The very air had become poisoned. The response was immediate but paralyzed. The police were trained for thieves and riots, not airborne poison. The fire brigade possessed only water and hoses, useless against a chemical tide. The threat was unprecedented, defying all existing emergency protocols. Panic, colder and more potent than the noxious cloud, began to spread. The initial victims were the unseen. Sparrows plummeted from the eaves, and street dogs collapsed silently in the alleyways. The toxic cloud, having already claimed its territory near the docks, was now rapidly seeping into the lower, residential districts, an insidious, creeping tide of death. Croft's spectacular failure, which had so engrossed the city, had been an accidental prelude, a loud distraction for the true, silent catastrophe that had been unleashed by the greed of Mr. Beaumont. The only sound now was a low, unnatural hiss as the chemicals mingled with the damp city air. Elara, overwhelmed by the stench of the advancing chemical cloud and the sudden, terrifying chaos, finally pulled Bartholomew away from the wreckage, stumbling towards the relative safety of a narrow side alley. She intended to dismiss the strange metal object he clutched, viewing it merely as a piece of dangerous debris. "Bartholomew, let go of that thing," she instructed, her voice tight with rising panic. "It's just rubbish from the professor's mess." But the boy refused, his eyes wide, holding the item out for her to inspect. It was heavy, dark, and still faintly warm to the touch. "It doesn't smell like wood, Mama. It smells like the water near the docks." Elara finally looked. It was a valve, clearly meant to regulate pressure or flow, and it bore a distinctive, chemical residue, a greasy, slightly yellow film that matched the unnatural color of the encroaching cloud. This was no ordinary valve. With a sudden, chilling clarity, Elara recognized the maker's stamp, a small, almost invisible B.C.W. etched into the brass. She knew that stamp intimately. She had stitched canvas for the enormous storage tanks at the Beaumont Chemical Works years ago. This piece of metal was not from the whimsical, broken ornithopter. A wave of realization, cold and brutal, washed over her. The failure of Professor Croft's flying machine was not an isolated event. It was a colossal, noisy distraction. Mr. Beaumont had been attempting to suppress the fact of a disastrous chemical leak at his refinery, and the professor's high-profile, self-inflicted disaster had provided perfect cover. Bartholomew, in his innocent, childlike curiosity, had uncovered the key evidence. His small, simple observation, that the valve's residue matched the foul smell now suffocating the air, linked the wreckage on the cobblestones directly to the advancing, toxic green-yellow fog. Croft's failure had not caused the catastrophe, it had merely provided the stage for its unveiling. Elara now knew the true, monstrous identity of the enemy the city faced. The toxic cloud had pushed its deadly frontier closer, turning the lower alleys into a choking, deserted landscape. Elara, her face covered with a wet handkerchief, knew they had minutes, not hours, to act. The official response had collapsed into panicked inaction. The only resource left was the man who had failed so spectacularly. She located Professor Croft in a small, guarded room adjacent to the police station. He was laid out on a makeshift cot, nursing a bandaged head and a broken arm. His face was a mask of utter devastation, his eyes blankly fixed on the cracked plaster ceiling. He was in a state of profound, post-crash shock, his ego and spirit annihilated by his public disgrace. Elara pushed past the weary constable and approached him, placing the small, telltale brass valve on the cot beside his uninjured hand. "Professor Croft," she said, her voice sharp with urgency. "You were wrong about the sky, but you were right about one thing. The air is the enemy. But it's not the wind." Croft barely registered her presence. "Go away, madam," he mumbled, his voice defeated. "It is over. I am ruined. A failure." "A failure of flight, yes," Elara countered, leaning in close, forcing him to focus. "But not a failure of genius. This," she tapped the valve, "is from Beaumont's chemical works. He caused this fog, and your crash was his shield. The city is facing its death, Professor. It's an airborne, man-made enemy." She then delivered the crucial blow. "Your machine, your scrap, your magnificent framework of failure. It is the only thing strong enough and light enough to build a solution. We don't need a machine to fly, we need a defense to live." She appealed not to his boundless ego, which was now pulverized, but to the cold, rational core of the inventor she knew existed beneath the showman. She demanded his expertise, his materials, and his unique understanding of air and stress. The pact was sealed by necessity and desperation. While Elara sought to galvanize the defeated professor, Mr. Barnaby Beaumont was in a flurry of self-preservation, entirely detached from the toxic reality he had unleashed. From the supposed safety of his heavily shuttered office, He worked to suppress all knowledge of the chemical leak. The incident was the result of his own reckless directive, an illegal, untested process initiated to maximize production and profit at the expense of safety. His first priority was damage control over the narrative. He furiously attempted to bribe, then threatened, the few city officials still functioning, ensuring that all public statements centered solely on Professor Croft's unfortunate engineering folly. He made it clear that the focus must remain on the inventor's incompetence, thereby deflecting all scrutiny from the source of the airborne threat. But Beaumont's actions went beyond mere cover-up, they turned actively monstrous. He viewed the advancing chemical fog not as a tragedy, but as a necessary cleansing of the undesirable lower-class districts adjacent to the docks. He had long desired to redevelop that area, and the swift, silent eradication of its inhabitants served his ultimate goal perfectly. He actively worked to sabotage any nascent efforts to build a barrier or containment, claiming publicly that such measures were hysterical overreactions, and privately ordering his remaining loyal foremen to block access to materials. Mrs. Evadne Beaumont, overhearing a frantic, incriminating exchange between her husband and his solicitor, finally grasped the true, sickening nature of his character. Her skepticism was replaced by horror. She looked out at the yellow-green haze now visible from their drawing-room window, and understood that their enormous, gilded wealth was not built upon hard work, but upon deliberate, murderous deceit. She was witnessing not the collapse of an invention, but the moral ruin of the man she had married. Her polite society facade shattered, revealing a deep, terrifying void of complicity. Professor Croft, roused from his catatonic state by Elara's fierce challenge and the undeniable proof of Beaumont's wickedness, finally found a focus beyond his own ego. He was injured, a fractured arm and various contusions, but his mind, the intricate engine of his peculiar genius, was fully engaged. The panic in the streets was replaced by the cold, methodical calculation of the engineer. Working from his cot, his face pale and drawn, he began to sketch furiously on a piece of wrapping paper with his uninjured hand. He was no longer designing a vehicle for the sky, but a defense for the ground. His goal was a gigantic, makeshift filtration and ventilation system, a structure that would act as a massive, wind-powered shield to divert and dissipate the incoming toxic plume. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity, relying not on new, untested components, but on the very materials of his colossal failure. He directed Elara to gather the salvaged, light framework of the ornithopter. The tall, articulated wooden spars, once meant for majestic flight, were now to be used as scaffolding. The torn canvas, which Elara had warned him about, would serve as a giant filter, laced with layers of salvaged cloth and charcoal from nearby workshops. The structure must be anchored against the wind, not powered by it. Croft instructed, his voice regaining its old, sharp authority. We will use the lift principles, but in reverse, to push down to divert. The main drive gear, the largest one, use it as a winch. Transform the tools of failure into the mechanism of salvation. Elara and Bartholomew, his small, silent apprentice, were dispatched to gather the pieces. The gears, which had scattered like shrapnel of a shattered dream, were now being painstakingly retrieved, transformed from symbols of spectacular incompetence into the essential tools for the city's survival. Croft's redemption lay not in finally achieving flight, but in using his unique vision to protect life on the Earth he had tried so desperately to escape. The climax arrived with terrifying swiftness. The toxic fog, a sentient, pale green-yellow monstrosity, had fully enveloped the dockside and was now surging through the main thoroughfares, casting a sickly, supernatural pall over New London. The city was under siege, the air turning thick and metallic, stinging the eyes and choking the breath. Elara, Bartholomew, and a small, desperate band of civilians raced against the clock. This band included the newly repentant Mrs. Beaumont, whose gilded facade had cracked entirely, revealing a woman determined to atone for her husband's monstrous actions. She offered her substantial influence and remaining resources, directing laborers to the task with a fierce, unexpected competence. Guided by the brilliant, frantic instructions of the bedridden Croft, shouted from his window and relayed via a complex network of ropes and hand signals, they worked with feverish intensity. The goal was to erect the skeletal structure of the ornithopter in the path of the densest part of the fog. The broken wooden spars, once destined for flight, were hauled upright, forming a massive, rickety frame. Elara and Mrs. Beaumont secured the remnants of the canvas, now laced with bags of charcoal and scraps of filtering cloth, creating a crude, but enormous, air shield. Bartholomew, his eyes stinging, tirelessly collected and fitted the salvaged gears onto makeshift winches, ensuring the framework could be held rigid. Just as the worst of the toxic plume reached their position, the last section of the structure was anchored. The wind, which Croft had once so disastrously miscalculated, now became their unexpected ally. Instead of lifting a vehicle, it caught the massive, canvas-covered shield. The structure held, creating a zone of high pressure that did not block the fog entirely, but effectively diverted and dissipated the worst of the toxic surge away from the most densely populated residential areas. They had transformed the very symbol of failure into a scaffold for salvation. The mechanical man had not flown, but its wreckage had saved the day. 1 year later, the scars on New London were visible, but the city had survived. The immediate crisis of the Great Gas Cloud had passed, leaving behind a profound change in the public consciousness and the social order. Mr. Barnaby Beaumont and his wife were gone. Financially and socially ruined by the revelations of their toxic negligence, they had fled the city in disgrace. The Beaumont Chemical Works lay derelict, a monument to corporate greed and hubris. Professor Algernon Croft was no longer the subject of ridicule. His face, once contorted by desperate ambition, was now etched with a quiet, hard-earned respect. He had not achieved the glory of flight, but he had accomplished something far more meaningful: the practical defense of a city. He now worked from a modest, clean new workshop, his genius applied to civic engineering problems. The site of the great crash was transformed. The wreckage of the flyer of the age did not vanish. Instead, its strong, light framework remained as a permanent scaffold. It had been utilized to support a series of massive, working ventilation fans and air filtration units, designed by Croft to prevent future atmospheric disasters. The machine of failure had become the foundation of permanent protection. Bartholomew, now 8, stood beside Croft. He was no longer just an orphan of the streets, but the professor's official, if unofficial, apprentice. His small hands were surprisingly competent with a wrench. He wore a patched coat, a tangible symbol of his mother Elara's improved circumstances. She was now the chief supervisor of the new ventilation system's canvas maintenance. Bartholomew studied the old blueprints, tracing the lines of the magnificent, flawed wings with a calloused finger. He had learned the hard truth. True vision lay not in seeing the endless romantic possibilities of the sky, but in correctly identifying and addressing the tangible dangers on the ground. In the corner of the workshop sat the repaired camera that had captured the moment of disaster. It was pointed not towards the clouds, but firmly at the resilient, dust-streaked faces of the two engineers, the older man's experience guiding the boy's quiet certainty. The mechanical man had never flown, but the engineer had finally grounded himself in reality, and in doing so, he had soared.